Welcome to the SDA Housing Podcast, brought to you by NDIS Property Australia. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin.
Hello everybody, my name is Minh and I'm your host from Individualised Property Australia, and you're listening to the SDA Housing Podcast, a show that explains, highlights, guides and brings awareness about all things SDA in this ever-changing NDIS world. Today's part 2 collaboration with HireUp is with our amazing guest speaker, Aviva Beecher. Aviva, welcome.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
So our last podcast with your team was with Stephanie and Lowry from Sydney, and you're based in...
I'm in Melbourne.
Wonderful. So you guys are everywhere, right?
Yeah, we're all across Australia. Yep.
Yeah. I think when I met Lowry in Canberra about 3 months ago, she said there were, 15,000? 7,500 participants, 7,500 work carers, is that right?
I don't know what we're up to now. Yeah,
big numbers.
It's been a lot of growth. Yeah.
Well, today's episode is about ILO. Before we go into that, I want to read some information about what the categories are in supported independent living and SILS categories. The background on home and living supports are as follows. There are different types of supports we might see in participants' plans, and they would be the following categories, 7 categories. Personal care supports, home modifications, short-term accommodation, medium-term accommodation, specialist disability accommodation, supported independent living, still, and the last one, ILO, individualized living options. Aviva, what is ILO?
It's pretty new, and a lot of people have heard of it but not quite sure about it. It certainly doesn't roll off our tongues the same way as SDA and SIL do that, does it? So individualized living options, the whole idea is that it's kind of in the name, right? They're arrangements that are really individualized and tailored around the participant. So part of what's really cool and what I get excited about ILO is that they include informal supports being built into the arrangements. So I'll just give you some examples. There are kind of 4 different shapes that ILO arrangements tend to take. The first one is called living alone, the NDIS calls it, and this might be somebody living in a granny flat or an apartment or, sometimes even in an SDA property by themselves, and having some structured paid and unpaid support. So they might have support workers drop in to do bits and pieces with them, but they might also have a neighbour that they're friendly with, or, maybe their parents live around the corner and they're spending a couple of nights there, or, it could be all sorts of things. So that's living alone. The second one is living together, which is where an NDIS participant actually shares a home with another NDIS participant and might actually share some supports as well. The third one is living with a housemate, and that might look like having, it might look like to anybody else, might look like a really regular share house that, you lived in your 20s, and, there might be 1 or 2 other people that are living with that participant. But in this case, that housemate might actually receive a stipend or reduced rent that's funded from that ILO plan in exchange for specific support. And that could look like anything from kind of helping prompt somebody with their personal care to driving them to an appointment, to going to the gym, whatever it is they need with their, living, support to live the way that they want to live, which is a really nice way of actually helping people to live beautifully together and to make it affordable for everyone as well. And you might combine that with then paid drop-in supports too. And the last one is living with a host. So a lot of people that we see who are in this arrangement have previously been in foster care arrangements, for example, and it's working really well with foster mum and foster dad, and they actually want to stay there after they turn 18. So you can use that ILO package to provide some kind of stipend to that host family in exchange to in the same way that the foster care payment might previously have done. So yeah, that's broadly what ILO looks like. It can kind of take those 4 different forms. There's always informal supports built in, really individualised around a participant, and often combining various different types of supports as well.
Yeah. So ILO only came to the NDIS sector ecosystem a year and a half ago. Is that right?
Yeah, about that. It's been around in Western Australia in various forms for a couple of decades, and there was some policy that came through in August last year. So since then, we've been seeing it in people's plans more often.
Do participants get a choice to live? Does the NDIA, the commission, they choose whether the participant lives in a group home environment or an ILO home, or is it more of a upon request from the participant themselves?
Such a good question. If it's okay with you, I might tell you a bit about the process that you might go through to get ILO, which I think might answer your question. So the same way as it does with, I think, a lot of those acronyms you read out before, SDA, SIL, ILO, they all start with a home and living supports request form. So you can Google that. You can type it in, home and living NDIS form. You'll find that. And that form prompts you to write a bit about where you're up to, where you live, what support you need, and what support you're asking for from the NDIA. So your listeners might be familiar with that form in the context of asking for SDA or for SIL. And it's the same with ILO. So instead of asking for SDA and SIL, you ask for ILO. And with that form, you also need to put in a change of circumstance form and submit all of the evidence, the same kind of evidence like an occupational therapy assessment, other sorts of allied health evidence. And we often ask for parents and carers to write a letter as well, or an individual statement, all of those sorts of things that create a case for the NDIA to see this as a reasonable and necessary support that is required for the participant to actually have equal access to all of the things they need to live their life and achieve their goals. You do need to have a home and living goal in your plan, which I think is probably true for the others. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So all of those things need to happen. So you put in that home and living form, you put in all of the evidence and the change of circumstance form, and then the NDIS home and living panel reviews that and will often come back and give you what's called exploration and design funding. So stage 1 funding, it's sometimes called stage 1 ILO. And that can be 30, 50 or 100 hours. And it's funded at the same rate as support coordination at $100.14. And it appears in your core budget rather than your capacity building budget. And that funding is there to work with often a provider who does stage 1 planning, or like HireUp, or, there's a bunch of other providers that do it as well, or sometimes your support coordinator, your circle of support, to make a plan. What might living independently and living in an ILO look like? How could that work for you? And we go through a process at HireUp of looking, what are all of your support needs? What are all of the things and the people that you have in your life? What are all of your goals? And not just the sort of high-level ones that the NDI asks for, but what do you want your home to look like and feel like, and where do you want to be, and what's going to get you there? What's going to make you feel great? And really getting into the nitty-gritty of all of that. And also doing all of those practical things like, what does the budget look like week to week? How much money would you need, either out of, your salary or your DSP or another source to be able to live the way that you want to live? What kind of NDIS funding would you need to do it? And, if you wanted that example of living with a housemate, if you wanted to offer them a stipend, how much would you need to budget in order to do that? So we go through all of that, and any really good stage 1 provider will do that with you as well. And the outcome of all of that exploration and design work is what's called a service proposal, an ILO service proposal. So you can Google that as well, ILO service proposal NDIS, and there's a template there which you can have a look at. And that goes through and asks you things like, how did you come up with this plan? What is going to happen in this plan? It asks you to talk about your primary and your supplementary support. So again, that example of the housemate. Housemate might be a primary support, and you might have supplementary support of, for example, mum and dad live nearby and or you might have a HireUp support worker drop in, or whatever it is. And it also asks you to break down the hours and the cost of those things, and it functions like a quote. So ILO stage 2 funding, which is the stuff that appears in your package that actually allows you to get this done, it is available in 3 levels. The first level is up to $105,000. The second level is up to $150,000. And the third level is up to $230,000. And often the NDIA will pre-approve one of those levels of funding when they return your home and living form as well. So this service proposal acts as a plan and as a quote and unlocks that funding for stage 2. The other thing that the NDIA always asks for in that service proposal is monitoring and redesign. And this is a really important part of ILO as well. We don't expect even outside of disability, we don't expect our lives to stay the same. We don't expect our living, options to stay the same. And I'm thinking about where I spent, in my 20s in share houses. I had people coming and moving in and out, and every couple of months, in some places, at some point I was like, I don't want to live with 4 people anymore. I'm going to downsize. Eventually I've moved in with my partner, and all of those developmental life stages are so that happens, right? And our living situation needs to respond to that. So the idea of monitoring and redesign is the agency acknowledging nothing stays static, and we need to keep an eye on, is this working? And if it's not working, how can we shift things and change things to actually make it work? So that's a really important part of stage 2 as well. Anyway, you then put in this service proposal, you unlock the funding, and off you go. You've got a really clear plan about the next stage that you're taking because you've done all this deep dive work. And then you implement your plan. You might be finding a housemate, you might be finding some property, you might be working with an SDA provider, you might be working with a support work provider. All of these really exciting and sometimes very scary things, scary for participants, also scary for carers sometimes. This can be for some people moving out for the first time and, helping particularly mum and dad think, what do I just do every day? How do I actually support this person? Because I just do it. I don't think about it. What's going to happen when I'm not there? How will that look? And going through this deep dive process really allows those things to come out. And then for stage 2 to start and progress in a really exciting and safe way.
Wonderful. Well, you've answered the question about how the funding works. But the next question is, how big is this market? I mean, you said it's been around with WF for decades, and we've established that it came to the ecosystem only a year and a half ago. How big is this ILO thing? Because I met a support business in Brisbane here, and they said this ILO thing is not working. And I had no way to respond to that because I didn't know how big it was, how important it is. Is ILO going to be a core part of the ecosystem long term, or is this a little trial process that the NDIS is bringing to cover the gaps in the system?
It's a great question. My impression is that the NDIS is really committed to this. And there are a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is that we know until now there haven't been that many options for people with disability to feel really confident about the housing. We know that there's only SDA available for 6% of the market, and that's, 6% of the very small percentage of people with disability in Australia who are actually eligible for the NDIS. So there needs to be another option. SIL is, you often need to demonstrate through your occupational therapy report and other evidence that you need 24 hours of direct support. And that might either be, probably not at a 1-to-1 ratio a lot of the time. I don't know about, your listeners, the properties that they're mostly involved with. I imagine that there's multiple people living in the houses a lot of the time, multiple residents, and not necessarily the same number of workers there all the time. But there would be somebody there all the time on site in most of these arrangements. Whereas with ILO, it's pretty rare that somebody would need 24/7 active support like that. So the eligibility criteria for ILO is that you would need between 6 and 24 hours of support per day in the house. So that doesn't include community participation funding. It's just in the house. It's what SIL would be otherwise, right? And I was actually, to answer your actual question, which is how big is the market, if there's this fabulous little bit of the internet that's data.ndis.gov.au, and you can kind of get in there and have a look at what's actually happening in the market. Last time I looked, it looked to me like there were 800 participants who were actively using and claiming ILO line items, and that there were 800 who were in stage 1. So, and that's happened in the last year, right? So it's looking like, let's assume that everything moves through pretty fast. It's looking like this market is doubling over the next few months. I think it's serious, and I think it's such a beautiful option that actually will save the taxpayer money in the long term in comparison to SIL, and have really great social outcomes for people with disability and for inclusion more generally as well. You know, we're just seeing such beautiful relationships happening between housemates and people with disability, and really doing deep work and asking people questions, and participants and parents and carers asking questions that no one's ever asked before about how can you do things differently. Mm-hmm. So my feeling is that the market is growing and that it's an important market. And also, like with everything in the NDIS, it's our job as both, both the supply and demand side of the market to shape the market and to take the opportunity to make it our own. There's a lot of grey in ILO in the policy, and also just in the nature of it being really individualised, which can be pretty scary. And it means for a provider that you sometimes you're taking on a lot of risk, because it's not cut and dry in the same way that SIL is. It can be really different, and you can have 5 different participants with 5 completely different arrangements. Okay. But that's so exciting and juicy as well, right? That's not every day that we get to shape such an important piece of social impact.
Yep. I agree with you. It's great to see that there's a missing piece being covered in the system. But I want to ask you this question, that is 800 too small a sample to show that the system this market, the sector, this segment of the NDIS will grow to a bigger level, like the SIL and the SDA sections? Or will this forever be a small, very small part of the 555,000 population in the NDIS pool at the moment? What are your thoughts in the next few years? Will this 800 become a few thousand, 10,000 of the 500,000? What do you think? Is there scope for that? Thoughts?
I love that question. I'm feeling nervous about staring into my crystal ball in front of your audience. I'm seeing consumers become more critical in a really good way. I did a PhD a few years ago looking at market stewardship and at consumer demand in the NDIS. And the thing that I saw really consistently is that when consumers had experience, they made different and more confident decisions. And I'm seeing, even in the inquiries that we're getting, I'm seeing people who have experienced SIL or have experienced various different living arrangements coming and saying, I don't feel satisfied. I want something that works for me and my family and my network. And I want some help thinking that through. I want some help designing it. And again, I think this is a bit of I think it can be as big as we make it. I don't want to, I guess the other piece is we are seeing some questioning about SIL and about the appropriateness of SIL for a lot of participants. And in terms of really good social outcomes and taxpayer value, I think ILO has the potential to be massive for everyone. I think it's got so much potential to be a winner. So I'm betting really heavily on this. I'm saying yes, this is growing. I'm seeing it grow. I'm seeing consumers and families more and more ask for what they need and even ask for help finding out what they need because they know they're not satisfied with what they've got right now. And that to me indicates that it is growing and will continue to grow.
Okay. So a offshoot question back to WA is, if the ILO system has been operating, or equivalent style ILO has been operating for the last few decades in WA, of the 800 on ILO right now around Australia, what proportion of that 800 is actually based in WA, do you think?
It's a great question that I actually think the NDIS data could immediately and very cleanly answer. So I don't actually want to guess.
That's okay.
Because I will immediately be able to prove myself wrong when we get off the call.
Oh, good. So the next question is, I don't know whether you've answered this question yet, is who is it for, and can you give us examples of how of it working with HireUp participants?
ILO, again, this is such an annoying thing to answer, but I answer it all the time when I'm talking about ILO, which is it depends. It really is individualized, and it's in the title, but it really is. So we've got people who are coming from all walks of life. We've got people all over the country of all ages, some of whom are moving out of home for the first time, as you know, I talked about before, and are really thinking, you know, about taking their first adventure outside the house. Others have tried a whole lot of different things and it hasn't worked and they want something new. And a few other people kind of nearly have it right, but want some support because, you know, there's a few situations where mum and dad might be really involved and actually they'd like to be able to go on a holiday for a month. We've had, one of the things that I'm most proud of is we've had some parents be able to do that. They went on a holiday for a month and that just makes me so happy that that's happened. And, you know, I can think of a few other examples where we often put a sort of a key work, we call them lifestyle coordinators, to help with that monitoring and redesign process, but really just to make sure that everything's going well. And a few circumstances where that's gone so well and mum and dad are so relaxed that the coordinator themselves has gone away for a few weeks and mum and dad are like, it'll be fine. And, you know, this is after spending their whole lives and decades of their lives really like taking all of that accountability and responsibility for their well-being of their child and being very stressed about it. So you asked, who is this for? Sometimes this is for parents and circles of support as much as it's for participants. But, you know, in terms of the actual demographics, we're working with people who have diagnoses as a psychosocial, who have autism diagnoses, who have accessibility needs, a few with sort of comorbid things going on. So all sorts of complex stuff going on for them in their lives. I gave the example before of people aging out of foster care. So quite a few families who, you know, are thinking for the first time, I've been like kind of sole carer to this person for a really long time. What do I want the next decade to look like? Is this still right for me? And is this still right for them? How can I continue to be a parent and to not burn out and to help my child continue to grow and to continue to develop their skills and independence, even if I think they'll stay with me for a really long time? What does that look like? Yeah.
I want to ask you a question which has been on my mind for 2 years now. And that is, for a participant to be living in an ILO environment, meaning share with a host or, you know, by themselves or with someone else, and it is costly to live on your own in general, normally. If a participant is living in an ILO in a one bedroom unit or two, whatever it is, right? How can they afford the cost of living, given how bad the cost of living is in today's life? In the news we hear every day right now, it will be more extremely hard for a participant to be living in an ILO. Is there enough funding? We don't know the funding here. Is there enough funding to cover their lifestyle costs and their living arrangements with the care support that you're talking about? Can you please elaborate on those numbers?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you it depends again, right? So the really key thing to remember is that part of the reasonable and necessary criteria for the NDIS is that they don't pay for rent. And obviously the exception there is the SDA arrangements where some of that is subsidised. And, we can get into the definitional stuff around rent, but basically the NDIS can't pay for anything that isn't everyday costs like rent, utilities, etc.
Yeah.
So that's one of the struggles here. And sometimes somebody will have, I often ask people, if you could wave a magic wand, what would this look like, if you had it all your way? And sometimes the reality is, we can't afford to do that. Disability or no disability, sometimes we can't afford to do exactly what we want to. But the process of exploration and design of doing that 30 to 100 hours of deep diving is how can we really distill what the pieces are that are very, very important? What are the things that are going to actually unlock your ability to be your biggest self and your happiest self, to meet your developmental milestones, keep growing? What are the things that we absolutely need to make sure are there? And how can we make that happen? How can we, be really creative about how we do life? And one of the reasons that, I've lived in a share house in the past is I can't afford a whole lease myself. So I rent my room and I split the utilities. And, that's one of the things here too, right? Like living with more people brings the cost down. And that might not feel like an option for somebody who feels nervous about relationships or who isn't sure if they'll be able to cook for themselves, or I'm just thinking about things that different families and different participants are worried about, and certainly the parents are worried about. I do this for my child, who's going to do it for them when they're no longer living with me? But thinking about ways that we can unlock the potential of relationship and of informal relationship to provide that kind of support it's pretty magical. Yeah. So that's part of the work of the ILO arrangement. But it obviously makes a difference. On some people can afford, because they've got a job or their parents can help them or whatever it is, they can afford a bit more rent. Other people, we need to think really creatively about how that could look.
I think long term, if I had a crystal ball right now and I looked into it right now, I would say, and I'll declare it, and here I am on a podcast live online, that is, with half of the participants in the NDIS right now, half of the 55,000 people are under age 18. That's a fact. Number two, we also know is it's very hard to create property product in Australia. There's a big rental shortage at the moment around Australia. So if it's hard for a normal person or normal families to find a rental accommodation, it'll be much more harder for the participants who are currently at home as young children as well. That's a fact. We'll see definitely more the granny flat style home builds in the backyard with mum and dad and the main house and them living in the right while they're own in the backyard in that ILO structure there, because unpaid supports, mum and dad right there, 6 to 24 hours, as you say, coming in. There you go. I think we'll see more ILO numbers coming in the next 5-10 years. Aviva, you are right. We'll watch this space. And I definitely say we'll see more of the ILO numbers beefed up by the younger generation coming through in the years to come. That's because what are their options? Try and get into SDA, too hard. Live in a group home further out from where the mum and dad is, probably not. And at some point, mum and dad's going to grow too old and too weak to be able to handle a full-time role of being a carer for a young adult as well. So the ILO model is sort of that in-between solution between SDA, SIL, and being stuck where they are right now. So, yeah, I think it's good to see the NDIS come out with this new option, and time will tell how successful it is, I guess, yeah. Speaking of SIL, my next question is, in your view, what is the difference between SIL and ILO?
So there are a few, and I sort of make the disclaimer firstly that there are a lot of SIL providers who actually individualise beautifully and who work with families, share governance, and do some really creative practice. And there can be, on the other hand, some ILO arrangements that involve multiple NDIS participants living together and sharing ratioed supports. So they can look really similar. I also note that you can use SIL funding and core funding and ILO funding each in really creative ways. So I just wanted to start with that and just say that there is a spectrum and there's all sorts of greys in between these two things. But for the most part, when you think about SIL, a lot of the time you think about a group home, so multiple people living together who you haven't necessarily chosen to live with, and sometimes you might not get along with particularly well. And support workers who you also haven't necessarily chosen. And a feeling generally of not having a lot of choice and control a lot of the time. And again, I want to just reiterate that that's not the same for every SIL provider, and it's not even the same across houses, and there are some phenomenal SIL providers. But when you think about kind of the archetypal SIL, that's often what you think about. And the other thing that I said earlier was to demonstrate that you need SIL. Most often what you need to demonstrate is you need that 24/7 active support available to you. So quite high needs for a lot of people a lot of the time. Also, like the average price of SIL is also a fair bit higher than the average price of ILO. I talked about those bands before of ranging up to 105, up to 150, up to 230. And I believe that the average price of SIL across Australia is probably more like over that top band of ILO. It's probably more like 250. That might not be right.
The average, from a year ago I saw, the average SIL funding was 79,000 per participant across Australia.
79,000?
Yeah, the average.
Okay. Well, I might have that completely wrong in that case. My impression was that on the whole, on average, SIL costs more than ILO, but maybe I've got that wrong. Whereas in an ILO arrangement, I've sort of just been speaking about, let's put the cost to the side. I've obviously got that wrong. In an ILO arrangement, it's really, there's such a focus on doing that deep dive. The process to get SIL, and you'll know this better than I do, but the process to get SIL is doing that roster of care, getting that, what do you need every hour of every day, getting that agreed package with the SIL provider, knowing what house you're going to move into and the shape of the house before you move in, and quite structured, which really suits some people, right? It really suits some people's needs. ILO, there's more moving parts. It's looser. I'm always going to say it depends, and it probably depends this year to next year, or maybe Monday to Tuesday. There's a lot more freedom and a lot more reliance on informal supports rather than those formal supports. And with that comes a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot more choice and control. And again, not for everybody, right? Not for everybody to do that work of think about doing 30 to 100 hours of thinking about your life and planning. That's a lot of work. It's not for everybody. And it's certainly not for everybody to think about getting informal supports involved in their life on a regular basis either. It's not for everybody. But and again, the other thing that I said before is that the eligibility criteria for ILO starts at 6 hours of support per day required to do life. Not CP, just in the house, 6 hours. So quite a different need to demonstrating eligibility for SIL. That's kind of the three areas that I'd point to.
Good. How does SDA and ILO work together, and what opportunities are there for NDIS participants and investors in this area as well?
So this is a tricky one, and the NDIA themselves have not worked this out yet. And the tricky bit comes because, except with SDA, the NDIS won't pay for rent. So if you think about it depends on the setup, right? Like if you are one participant living alone in a 1-bedroom SDA property, you can do what you want in that. You can have the informal supports drop in, the support workers drop in. You might live in a concierge type environment where you can sort of have that constant passive, if something goes wrong, I've got that there. But actually, I love my neighbour and they come and have dinner with me every Thursday. You can do what you want. As soon as you start thinking about multiple rooms, from an investor perspective, they have calculated their return on investment based on each room being filled by an SDA participant. So that might look fine if you want to live with your mate who also has SDA funding and has the right amount of SDA funding to meet that investor's need. But if you want to live with a supportive housemate who is not an NDIS participant, it starts to look a bit funky for the investor, because the money that the NDI would otherwise put into subsidising the cost of that participant in that room over 20 years is not there anymore. So then the question is, how could you, within the bounds of reasonable and necessary, think about using ILO funding to reduce that cost, or think about the other participants paying market rent or above market rent? And it becomes a push and pull of thinking and a maths, like actually just sitting there with a spreadsheet going, what does my return on investment look like over a period of years? And is it worth my while, and under what circumstances is it worth my while? Because it costs a lot to build an SDA in comparison to just a regular build, right? And you want to make sure you get that return on investment. So it actually is going to depend on that situation. It's going to depend on the number of bedrooms in the house. It's going to depend on if that house is already being built. And, some investors might think, oh, I've had a vacancy for 2 years, let's just get someone in there. And it might be worth their while doing it. But it will involve conversations with not just the SDA provider, but also the investor about how flexible they're willing to be. But certainly we're talking about above market rental yield, but we're not talking about SDA rental yield as soon as you start talking about putting a non-SDA participant into an SDA house. Mm-mm. The other types of things we've started thinking about, and I would just love investors to start thinking about this, is how can we adapt existing stock to be pretty accessible? So I know of a still provider, for example, who spent, I think, like $10,000, $20,000 knocking out some of the cupboards under the sink, moving some of the PowerPoints, taking the hub out of the shower, and it's accessible enough for the people who live there. It's great, and it's actually creating more mainstream accessibility for people who need that. So I'm really interested in how can we look at other really awesome long-term investments to underpin ILO that kind of sit next to, but not necessarily in the SDA category, and or how can we build accessible apartments that might support really creative arrangements? And there are some really interesting SDA providers out there who would love to be co-designing this stuff. And for families who have a 5-year plan of, I want to move out and I want to make this work, that's perfect. That works really well. So I think there's some really cool creative work to do between investors and SDA properties and designers and participants in this space.
I totally agree with you, Aviva. We as a business here are changing the way we present the marketplace as opportunities to investors, saying there's much more to this than just SDA, because SDA is a costly process to build and deliver. It's also a costly process emotionally for the participants to go through the application process, the tribunals, fighting for the funding, just to get funding, right? That's a costly process for them alone. And we tell our listeners that there's more to this than just SDA. There's still housing, there's ILO housing. You can modify your existing home. And then, truth be told, I mean, I had an episode podcast yesterday with QSpec, a Queensland-based modification builder, and they're the biggest volume mods builder in Australia, for Southeast Queensland, being in Southeast Queensland. And a lot of participants need to be aware that they can, or families, I should say, they should tap into their funding to do mods to modify their current lifestyle, right? That's for families alone. But if you're an investor and you want to have a social impact and do good by the community, and you're not after money, one, or two, you can't afford to get into SDA anyway, right? Or there's no land in your area. There are other means, such as building a normal house with slight adjustments, with pre-designed modifications to allow for a small ramp, handrails, extra wide doorways, extra wide hallways. They are not necessarily SDA compliant, nothing to do with that, but just for the participants who don't qualify for the high needs, because that's only 6% of the market. The other 94% are in this market here, which is not being catered for at all, right? So you are right. With awareness and education to the marketplace and the people out there who go to the expos and the events, who want to get involved in the NDIS, there are other ways to deliver social impact housing for participants other than building a brand new high physical support wheelchair adaptable house. And that is to consider modifications to brand new or older dwellings just to suit that ILO environment. Because as I said earlier to you, Aviva, the future of this sector is going to be different. I mean, right now it's all about SDA housing being built. I know that, but by the year 2032, the forecast is 1 million participants in the NDIS. And a lot of them, I think, will come through from the younger generation coming through as young adults, right? So it's not all about SDA. It'll be a lot more about ILO and SIL housing, particularly hybrid housing where the family lives with their child long term. Because right now, what we're seeing is more so the median age is probably 45-ish, give or take, living with an elderly couple who are looking after them for the last 40 years, right? We're now seeing all these younger families coming through who are in their 5, 10, 15-year-old age bracket who will come through as young adults in the next 10 years. And I'm sure that those parents will think about, well, we've got 30 years to live. We want to modify our house or build a new house to suit our lifestyle and our young adult child to live for the next 40 years of their life as a disabled person who doesn't qualify for SDA or SIL particularly, right? Or build a granny flat. So we'll definitely see some big change in the next 10 years for sure, I think. And with the way the funding is now blowing out to $100 billion by the year 2032, obviously. And there's going to be big demand and big outlays by the government to grow this NDI sector. And who knows what other segments will come out of this at the moment. It's not a perfect model right now. It's not perfect at all. But it all developed, and under the Labor stewardship, we'll see a lot more positive changes, I guess, in the next 5 to 7 years' time, I guess. Yeah.
And with that will come the need to demonstrate outcomes. That we talk about the spend, but we often forget to talk about the return on that spend. There's a couple of dollars coming in for every dollar that's spent. So I'm excited for the government to start measuring that. But it's also, our responsibility as providers of all of these sorts of things to be measuring the return on investment for the taxpayer, the return on investment for the individual, and actually the impact that we're making by doing all those things, right? Really exciting stuff there too.
Mm. So when I met Larry at Canberra at Disability Expo, she said to me that HireUp had just come into this ILO segment. Can you tell me why that is the case and how that come to be? Yeah,
sure. HireUp has a really beautiful culture of being curious and being very person-centered and very much about choice and control, and that's come the founders come all the way from the founders, from Laura and Geordie, who built this and have built Fighting Chance and Jigsaw also around their experience of their brother. And that's very much alive. That culture is very much alive. And about 12, 13, 14 months ago, there was a session of what could we do to actually lean in, increase our impact and stay aligned within our vision? What could we do next? And a couple of people in the company suggested, let's have a look at this ILO thing. And it matches beautifully, right? Like Fighting Chance, which Laura is the CEO of, she's co-CEO of HireUp as well. They've been doing SIL for a while. They have this really nice family governance model. So, that co-governance that I was talking about before. And for her, this is a matter of, like, it's the obvious next thing, like, of course we would help with this. This is, people use HireUp at home all the time. So let's help them create the home that they want as well. It absolutely flows on, A, from that, like, bright-eyed, what can we do next? And B, from what's the market telling us? What do we need? What are the people that we're working with doing, and how can we help them do it?
So when you say it was obvious, when the next steps, is it because your organisation sat there and said, well, we have 7,500 participants on our books. We have 7,500 support workers in our books. who are providing support to each other. Surely the ILO model would thrive. Well, with your system the way it is, surely you'd be able to identify a lot more ILO participants from your current platform. Surely.
Right. And we were talking about the market before. I just sort of caught identify participants, and I wanted to go back to the market for a second there, because part of the responsibility here when a new NDIS offering comes out is to educate and to actually say, this is a possibility here. So it's partly identifying, but it's also partly identifying where the opportunity is and the unmet need already exists, and having that extra offering. HireUp has reasonably recently put in a team of case managers, team managers essentially. So for those people who want the choice and control of, I want to do my own roster and choose my own people, but I don't actually want to schedule it all the time, there's a team of team managers who can do that as well. And we're starting to think more and more about how can we actually help people make life easier. And, that's always the thing, right? How can we help make life easier while having choice and control there? So it's about not just it's creating a market segment, but it's more broad than that. I've done so many webinars. Our team has done so many webinars and talked to so many different communities about this. And we work with support coordinators and plan managers and all sorts of people to actually, the same conversations that I've been having with you, of like, what's the next step? Like, how do I help somebody with this? How do I know if it's for me? How do I find out more about this? And how do I make sure that I'm going to do something that's going to work? How do I function in the anxiety of the, it depends, of the grey? And it's about creating demand, I suppose, through education and through giving customers more information, more confidence to actually increase their risk tolerance and increase their capacity to ask for what they want. And
So if your team is brainstorming, thinking, planning, and around all these ILO ideas, the question that anyone would be asking you would be, how is HireUp doing ILO differently?
We have a really lovely framework that is based on some best practice social work and coaching models. We have people in our team who are experts in housing who have come from SDA and SIL backgrounds, as well as OT backgrounds, social work backgrounds. We've got a really amazing multidisciplinary team, and we think holistically about the person. I was telling you before, we go into what's important to you at a level that's not just what are your NDIS goals. And by getting to know somebody so deeply and, having that opportunity with this exploration and design funding, we have an incredibly personalised approach around this individualisation. And we're able, using the database that we've got for those people who need support work and want to build teams, we can find the right people based on exactly what they want. And HireUp has a team of people who helps with that too. We have a team builder, a team called Team Builder, who literally will look through the database for you against the type of person that you need. And, that also allows us to be able to, we've become experts on finding great housemates, and for those people who have ever lived in a share house, finding a great housemate's really hard work. It can take a long time. And we've become really great at working with families, as we always have been in the attendant care business, working with families to build their capacity and ensure that they have the most informed choice and control that they have, but also walk that line of can we take the boring stuff off you? Can we, put the ad up for you, whatever it might be. Can we take that life admin off you to actually free you up to do the things that are important to you? And by having that flexibility, it really allows us to continue and to scale that individualization that we've got there, which is super exciting.
Cool. My last question for you, Aviva, is what is your advice to any listener who is listening to us right now, who may be a parent or a participant, or more so a parent, a family member, who doesn't know whether ILO is for their child, what is your advice to next steps for them to consider, how to, what to, your thoughts, please?
Well, the first offer that I've got is come and have a chat. I'll have a free chat with anybody, and my whole team will as well. So we are even, to the point of looking over people's paperwork. I'll give you a free half hour of just giving you some tips and tricks about how to do that. We also have a lot of resources and webinars that we've run, so that's a great place to start to just get an overview. I can recommend looking at the operational guidelines. If you like reading, the operational guidelines that the NDIS have produced about ILO are actually really good. They're very clear about what might make you eligible or ineligible and some of the ideas about how this process works. So that might be a good thing to do too. I would also connect with peers and see, the research that I did showed me that people, if you can find somebody that you perceive to be like you on social media, on Facebook, there are a lot of groups out there, reach out and hear what other people are doing. Or come to us and see if we can match you with somebody who's already got an experience as well. And, likewise, any other ILO provider. I would call a bunch of ILO providers and have a chat. Don't just come to us. Go to whoever you want to and shop around and see who makes you feel heard and what they think they can offer. Ask what that ILO provider has done with other people who are like you. Tell them the things that are important and ask them how they would work with you. Interview them, see what's out there. And I know that the NDI is putting together some resources about how could ILO look, what are some case studies, and there are a few videos out there that we've got a really lovely video up on our website of a couple of guys living in Sydney in an ILO arrangement. I know that Summer Housing has one up too. So have a Google, see what other people are doing, get inspired. But really, like the work that exploration and design, that this stage 1 design should do, should get you dreaming about what's possible and get you feeling excited as well as feeling all the nerves. So all of the what could happen if everything went right, as well as the what could happen if everything went wrong. And once you've had those conversations, you can put them down a bit, and you can start actually getting the things done and experiment. A lot of people often are thinking, I've got some families who are thinking about living together, and their next step is, let's go find an Airbnb for a couple of days and, see how that feels to live out of home. A few people have done that. So running little experiments, thinking about this as a transition period as well. It doesn't mean, you have to change from one day to the next where you live and what you're doing, but what are the things that need to be in place? How can we start building networks, building capacity, getting people involved who are going to help in the long term? This is not an overnight thing. This is not a thing to do in a rush. This is a thing to invest in for months and to get excited about and to plan and to hold a bit lightly as well and see what happens. So, I might have waffled a bit then, but it's part of the process, right? Like doing the research, starting to dream, think big, and starting to have those conversations as well, and fill the forms in, see what happens, see what starts converging.
Aviva, how do people access or read more of the resources you're referring to? Is there a website or a phone number? How do they go about this?
Yeah, if you Google HireUp ILO, you will find us. We have, if you go to the HireUp website, there is a drop down at the top that will give you the option to go to some ILO pages and to contact us.
And what's your website URL?
www.hireup.com.au.
Yep.
Come through to us there. There's a form to fill in, and one of our team will get in touch within the next day or so and have a chat with you and book in a time for you to meet me or one of my colleagues and have a chat about your circumstances and where you're at.
Awesome. Aviva, thank you so much for your time. We've broken the record. This is the longest podcast on our show so far of our 101 episodes. Thank you so much for your time.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed and following us so you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this podcast with those that could benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.